welcome to the MessianTics Podcast, a podcast about all things Messianic Judaism. Each episode, we will be sharing our opinions as we tackle some of the biggest issues in Messianic Judaism. Now here's your hosts, Rabbis Eric, David, Jonathan, and Toby.
This is Rabbi Eric, and we're glad that you joined us again this week. We're going to be discussing some Hanukkah, but really a variation of the theme of Hanukkah, and then we're going to expand it out to some various different branches that flow from that. And that's the reality that while Hanukkah is an amazing celebration, it's a time for family, it's a time where we light menorot, and it's the festival of lights. It's the Feast of Dedication. It's many things, and unfortunately in America, it has become a Jewish Christmas celebration with gifts and presents, and the focus of Hanukkah has really shifted. And the true theme or message of Hanukkah is about the battle against assimilation. It's the context is that the Jews of that day were actually in a civil war between those that wanted to follow the ways of God and those that had assimilated Judaism into a Hellenistic, Greek-Roman blended kind of religion where they were very much a part of the cultural liberalism of the day with Jewish trappings. And so it's a real serious thing, and it's something that we deal with in Messianic Judaism on a regular basis in different varied ways. For instance, when a Jewish person becomes a believer in Yeshua, there's always a wrestling match between how much of Judaism he keeps in his life or how much of Christianity he has come into his life. And then when we deal with how much of Christianity, there's all the variants of Christianity that bring in things that cause an assimilation to take place. When a non-Jewish person comes to Messianic Judaism, there's a contextual battle of how much of their culture they lay aside to take on a Judaic or biblical culture, or how much they hold on to as that goes on. When we're just dealing with Judaism, even Judaism today, when we expand it out, we deal with how much of popular progressive culture has become Judaism. When we talk about things like Jewish people in the United States especially, many are liberal in their politics and how they view things because of an assimilation into popular culture and a desire to be accepted as part of the norm. So whereas in shtetl Judaism of old, where Jewish people all kind of look like the Orthodox or Hasidim look today, wearing the black coats and the white shirts and all the things that with it, most of Judaism today, including Messianic Judaism, don't wear garments that outwardly expose us as Jews. Even to the point where many Jews, or most Jews in the United States, don't wear kippot on a regular basis. They don't wear tzitziot on a regular basis, some kind of an outward symbol of their Judaism in how they dress and look and act. So while we're getting ready to celebrate Hanukkah, which is the Feast of Dedication, it's a feast that celebrates a victory of the Maccabees and a rededication of the temple, we thought it would be a good topic for us just to bounce around how assimilation and the different variants of it affect Messianic Judaism as part of the MessianTics of Messianic Judaism. Where are these lines? What lines won't we cross? What things won't we do? And what things do we allow to become part of our more modern lifestyle?
Which the idea of assimilation is realistically a very pertinent conversation for us as Messianic rabbis within Messianic Judaism as a whole, because it is one of the primary comments that we often get from Christians, from other believers. Like when I go to teach at churches, and inevitably I always try to leave room for Q&A at the end, but inevitably you get the question of, well, if you really believe in Jesus, then why aren't you just a Christian? And the perspective is, well, why didn't you just leave Judaism and assimilate into the church, into Christianity, right? So it's still very much a conversation that needs to be had. And the truth of the matter is, and this is probably going to be one of those statements that's going to come back to bite me. I know we're going to get some sort of comment on this, but the truth of the matter is that what the church Big C is today is realistically a Hellenized assimilation of the body of Messiah. And I don't mean that to say like all Christians are Hellenized or all Christians are, whatever. That's not to say that Christmas and Easter are pagan or anything like that. I'm just saying that what we know the church Big C as today is a derivative still of the Roman kind of conquest, if you would, of the body of Messiah.
Right, and let's define Hellenized, because some of our listeners might think Hellenized as in going to hell. And I don't want them to think that. And it's a serious thing. Sometimes we use words people are unfamiliar with.
It comes from the Greek word hella, which is the actual Greek word for Greek.
Right,
and
so it's a matter of that when the Greek people, the Greek country, the Greek nation took over much of the world, as they took over the world, they brought their culture to the different nations, and then those nations then assimilated in some ways into Greek culture. So when we go to Israel, for instance, and we go to Caesarea, and we see the amphitheater, and we see the horse track for the racing, and those things, those are part of Hellenized, Romanized culture that were brought into Israel and became part of the culture of Israel there, even though that wasn't something that Jewish people didn't have amphitheaters and plays and those kind of things. The Romans and the Greeks brought that in, and it became part of who they were. So as we use the word Hellenized, I wanted to make sure that people that somebody wasn't hearing Christians are going to hell, because that's not what we're saying at all, and we want to make that clear.
Correct. Yeah, just use the big word, sorry. Went with the fancy historical theological term.
And it specifically comes from the time of Alexander the Great, as he as Macedonia took over and became its own empire. They brought a lot of what we call Greek culture. It's really a blend of Greek and Macedonian to the parts of Persia and to the Near East and into Egypt and parts of Africa that he took over as well. And because Alexander realized it's a lot easier to rule an empire if you can school the future generations and teach the future generations your culture, your language, your religions, your beliefs and practices, and your sports. Athleticism was a big thing that was brought in, which without fighting is a lot harder. Fighting costs lives. Fighting costs money. So if you're constantly having to fight to put, down insurrections and rebellions, it's a lot easier just to, when you conquer a place, put in some schools and
entertainment.
and it's just some entertainment, and bring and raise the kids. Don't let them read Torah, don't let them study Torah. Instead, let them read and study Greek philosophy. Let them read and study the writings of great thought leaders, as I'll say. Influencers, that's right.
So, but there are things that happen that influence and people assimilate in ways that we don't even think about. For instance, blue jeans were formed. I mean, they were designed in America. Blue jeans are an American invention, so to speak. And for years, for instance, you couldn't buy blue jeans in Russia because they didn't want American clothing worn by Russian people.
It was capitalists.
And so you could buy a pair of blue jeans for $10 in America and sell it for $100 or $200 in the black market in Russia. But if you look at the world today now, almost everywhere you go, you can find people who are wearing blue jeans, which is part of American culture that has influenced and caused a form of assimilation to where people dressing like Americans.
Cultural appropriation.
They're dressing like Americans by wearing blue jeans. But that's how assimilation creeps in. It's not always this hammer and sickle kind of thing, but a large part it's just, hey, we like the look of that piece of clothing, and we're going to start wearing it.
Of old Levi Strauss's invention there.
That's right.
Good Jewish guy.
So when we look at these things, we have to understand that not all assimilation was brought in by the sword. Some of it was just invited in by commerce and became how things were and how things are.
And some of it's useful, like jeans.
Yeah.
I was speaking of, like they were designed for miners, and what do most working men wear today? Either jeans or something close to it. Something that
right. So assimilation is much broader than just religion, although it is very much part of what that is and how things go. And different cultures bring in different forms of assimilation, and other cultures hold on to it. For instance, if you go to Panama, one of the things when I went to Panama a number of times, on Friday night, a lot of the Catholic homes will have 2 candles they light in the windows of their houses. Now, they're very much Catholic people by their faith, but the tradition of lighting Shabbat candles was part of their heritage. And so even though they're Catholic, they still light candles on Shabbat, even though they have no other connection to Judaism. That one piece of their heritage has continued on with them, even though the rest of their life has been assimilated into Catholicism.
And historically speaking, and Jonathan, you can talk more to this if you want, but historically speaking, Jonathan brought up the reality that the idea of Hellenization goes back to Alexander the Great and the combination of Macedonian and Greek cultures becoming kind of one and then spreading, became one of the fastest growing empires in history. But then after Alexander died, or was unalived, after he was unalived, Alexander's empire broke into 4 separate, 2 of which just kind of faded into the ethos, and then the other 2 became the Seleucid and the Ptolemaic empires. And the Seleucid and Ptolemaic empires realistically kind of went back and forth for Israel. They saw the value of the territory for commerce, for education, etc., and so they were kind of fighting back and forth over it. But in particular, the story of Hanukkah is because of the Seleucids trying to come in and take control of Israel and trying to force a Greek culture, a Seleucid flavor of Greek culture, of Hellenized culture upon Israel. And then the Hasmoneans and this kind of ragtag group of fighters that they had developed fighting against this massive world power and succeeding and winning in fighting against assimilation. When we look at the history of the Jewish people, there's kind of this back and forth on how we feel about assimilation. The reality is that Hasidic Judaism today exists because in the 15th century, 16th century, the Baal Shem Tov said, we don't like looking like everybody else, so we're going to make something different, and becomes this whole thing. And then you have a response to that with Reformed Judaism years later in Germany, where in the 19th century, where Reformed Judaism develops as a counter to Hasidic Judaism or Orthodoxy, to get rid of the religious aspect of Judaism, which a lot of Reformed Judaism has done today. But it wasn't intentionally get rid of the religious aspect of Judaism, but rather to say there's a place for the religious aspect and the culture of the people we live under, so we don't look so weird and out there and push off. And then that slowly became something that fully assimilated, and what Jewish practice maintained within Reformed Judaism today is solely cultural, not a faith thing, because they're more concerned about assimilation into the culture of the people that we live among. And then from there, we developed conservative Judaism in the 20th century, or late 19th into the 20th century. Conservative Judaism develops as a response to Reformed Judaism, and so they wanted to come back towards more of a traditional approach to Jewish life, but still maintain some sort of cultural connection to the societies we find ourselves living in. And so Messianic Judaism very much kind of fights its own battle in that sphere too, because you do have some Messianic synagogues that very much are, for lack of a better way of wording it, churches that meet on Saturdays and wear talits, right? And then you have Messianic synagogues that are super Orthodox leaning, and are really all about, we're going to do Shachrit every day, we're going to do Mincha every day, we're going to, have this, 6-hour service for Shabbat morning and go through every single liturgical prayer and reading imaginable and, and what have you. And then you've got, congregations in between that kind of fill the void all the way across the board. And then beyond that, we still are fighting with, okay, and I'll be the one to throw this topic out there, but how should or how do Gentiles assimilate into Messianic Judaism, right? And what is the acclamation, what is the accessibility, the inclusivity that is available to Gentiles in assimilating into Messianic Judaism? And is the terminology assimilating for Gentiles into Messianic Judaism a negative or a positive context? Like, what are we...
Because assimilation is not in itself a bad thing.
Correct.
And then when we really think about it, the United States exists because a group of Christians rejected the idea of assimilating into the national religion of their countries and came to this world so that they didn't have to assimilate, so they weren't forced to become part of the Church of England or the Catholic Church or one of the established governmental churches, so they could have it, which is why we're about to celebrate the holiday of Thanksgiving, which was originally instituted in the United States as a form of Sukkot celebration or harvest celebration, trying to be biblical in how they did. And so there is this constant tension between people of faith where it seems like a cosine thing where, it starts out with people that are strictly biblical and then they kind of go toward cultural and assimilate, and then they come back down to a more biblical stance, and then it kind of keeps going up and down like a chart, graph going up and down. And so we see this happening even today. So when people today talk to me and say, I don't think the world is ever going to get righteous again, or I don't think, but we look at the history of the world and it has constantly had this tug between a restoration and repentance to a biblical context and a worldly context. And it's constantly went up and down as time goes on. So as we look at the United States, we know it was founded by people who were rejecting assimilation, forced assimilation into a state-run or governmental form of Christianity, which they rejected. And so we see that happening. And even today, we find glimpses of that. For instance, as believers in Yeshua, we're almost expected, as believers in Jesus, I'll use that term because the context is that, we're almost expected to celebrate Christmas. You believe in Jesus, you should celebrate Christmas. It's the holiday of his birth. You should celebrate this, and it should be part of who you are. Yet most Messianics don't celebrate Christmas because it's outside of the scope of traditional Jewish feast days, biblical feast days. And so it's kind of an outside thing, more a cultural holiday than a religious holiday to us. And so there's this tension between people, as Rabbi David said, who say, well, if you believe in Yeshua, why don't you just become a Christian? And this is what Christians do. But there's this tension even in Messianic Judaism about, well, what do we do with the birth of Yeshua? Do we celebrate it at all? Do we celebrate it in December? Do we celebrate it in Sukkot in September or October? Do we celebrate it at Passover in the spring? How do we incorporate, or should we even incorporate? Because birthdays are not a biblical concept. It's a much more modern concept.
So I'm going to throw a whole other angle out because as you started talking, it made me think about this. So we recently found out in the last few years that we have a distant relative in Israel that we didn't know about. That because as far as we understood, our entire family, with the exception of my great-grandparents, died in the Holocaust. And then we find out through some roundabout stuff. Actually, it was because of a YouTube video that we found out about it. But we end up connecting with this guy who's a very distant relative, same last name, everything, but very distant connection and relative. And Rabbi Eric had an interesting conversation with him after we met him in person in Israel, earlier this year. And one of the questions that he was posing was, okay, in essence, he kind of came to the conclusion, okay, I don't have such a big issue. If you believe that Yeshua is the Messiah, that is what it is. I don't agree with you, but that is what it is. And I don't have an issue with you still calling yourself Jewish if you believe that Yeshua is the Messiah. My issue is, why do you not stop in your practice with the Judaism that Yeshua and his disciples knew, lived, and practiced? Why do you, in essence, assimilate rabbinic additions that came 200 years after Yeshua into Messianic Jewish practice today? Why do you assimilate those things into your tradition today? When you reject the rabbi's teaching that he's not the Messiah, you reject other teachings from the rabbis, why do you kind of cherry pick from the rabbinic world what you're going to add in? And I think that's an interesting angle also on this discussion of assimilation, because we, for lack of a better way of wording it, we do cherry pick what we're going to include and not include. I mean, how we tie our CTO. There's nothing in the Torah that tells us how to tie CTO, right? But we use the rabbinic traditions on how they say to do it.
Same thing with Passover Seder. The Haggadah that we follow, or Haggadah we follow, is a traditional rabbinic insert on how we practice Passover. Wearing a kippah is another thing that. So there are times where we have to determine as Messianic believers what portions of rabbinic Judaism, which is an assimilation of its own, because after the destruction of the temple, without having a sacrificial system, there had to be some kind of a formulated Judaism to unify the people of Israel, and the Talmud is written to become that form of cohesiveness, which is an assimilation from temple Judaism into this new rabbinic Judaism, this Pharisaic Judaism that continues on. So the conversation of assimilation is much broader than just are Jewish people assimilating into Christianity, or are Jewish people assimilating into modern culture, or those questions. But there's an assimilation that takes place just going from temple Judaism to Pharisaic or rabbinic Judaism in that term.
I think to some degree we're kind of creating a similar circumstance that we did with the episode that released on the 10th of November, which was entitled Dual Congregation Leadership, Messianic Jewish Rabbis in the Future, because we came out of that episode with way more questions than we did answers, and added more questions to those questions as we continue to converse. And I think we're kind of doing that here, which is not a bad thing. We just talked about this last night at CMC and Bible studies. The term Israel, Yisrael in Hebrew, literally means one who wrestles with God. And in Judaism, that's a very important part of our faith, is that idea of wrestling, not in a negative way, but wrestling with, who is God in my life? Who am I in relation to God? How does his word apply to my life? How do I live these things out? And I think that idea of wrestling with God is very much at the root of this conversation of assimilation. Who can assimilate into what? How do we assimilate? Is some assimilation kosher? Is it not? One of the things that really kind of bugs me about the body of Messiah today as a whole is that you can drive past virtually any large church on a Sunday morning as they're letting out. And I specifically reference large churches because you can do it 3 or 4 times, depending on how many services they have, that you can see this. But you could drive past virtually any large church in America, and you're hard-pressed to determine who's walking out of a Sunday morning church service versus who just walked out of a club the night before, from the way that we dress and carry ourselves and act. And I don't mean for that to be this whole social commentary, but the reality is the body of Messiah has very much kind of assimilated modern culture with the seeker-friendly model, and you don't want to make anybody feel odd or feel like they're being condemned or God forbid be convicted on anything. So we got to make everybody feel welcome and so on and so forth. And I think that seeker-friendly model plays into this conversation and creates I think as much headache as some of the rest.
Yeah, I'm curious, and I'm going to ask Rabbi Toby and Rabbi Jonathan if they can respond to this. And that is, as non-Jewish people who came into Messianic Judaism, there, by essence of becoming part of a community, there are some factors that become a different lifestyle or a change of lifestyle. And how did you determine for yourself what parts of Jewish practice you would assimilate into your life and what parts of Jewish practice you would not? And is there a line, or are you still in the process of adding or subtracting those things as time processes? So whichever one of you want to jump in at this point, I think it would be helpful and informative to the listeners to hear that portion of this process.
I think we mentioned that topic earlier in the discussion. We just never went into it.
Right.
We kind of went away from it. But what I was wanting to say was I was raised in the Baptist church, and it was all I knew. You know, I thought that, you know, Jewish people were Jewish, and they did Jewish stuff. And I was a Christian, so I did Christian stuff, and because I knew Jesus, and that was how I was raised, and did Christmas and Easter and all those things. Never once checked to see if any of those things were in the Bible, just because, you know, a lot of believers don't read their Bibles, even. Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, there are a lot that do, but I think there are a lot that don't. There are a lot that simply just don't know, and don't think to really study and check those things. I do remember, even as a young kid, though, wondering why. I do remember learning about the seventh day being the Sabbath day, because that was the day that God created. That was the day that God rested after He made creation. So that's why we rest on the Sabbath day. But I knew that the seventh day, which was the Sabbath, and I remember as a kid asking my mom why we meet on Sunday if the seventh day was the day that God rested, and my mom couldn't answer the question. Literally, she just was like, you know what, we're not talking about that right now. I mean, literally, that was what happened, so I had those questions, but it wasn't. It was never, you know, made to be a big deal. I was called into Messianic Judaism. I mean, I know God did it on purpose, but for me, it was like essentially an accident walking into a Messianic synagogue. You know, I didn't have a church to go to, and my dad had gone to one and said it was really great, and he had never talked about a place before the way he talked about this place. So I went, and that was where God really encountered me. As far as how I assimilated, because my encounter with God was of such intensity, I was literally ready to, like, I was fine just throwing everything in my previous life, with the exception of Jesus, away. With the exception of Jesus, because a lot of people do get up in arms and say, "Oh, wait a minute now," and it's not what. Everything except Him, I was willing just to get rid of. I didn't want to do Christmas ever again. I didn't want to do Easter ever again. I was fine. Just nope. Because it all made sense to me. Well, none of that's in the Bible. As far as how much and assimilate, I mean, I suppose it's not a negative term. It kind of sounds negative. I mean, maybe, but it's not a bad thing, I don't think. I think that if a Gentile wants to assimilate into Messianic Judaism, I think that I don't think that there should be any limitations to how much they can assimilate, as long as the theology is sound. For instance, if the reason why they're assimilating into Messianic Judaism and wearing tzitzits, wearing kippot, wearing a talit, what have you, if the reason why they're doing that is because they believe that's making them Jewish, then I think that that's wrong. That's not why I wear tzitzits. No, that's not why I worship on Shabbat. I do that because I love God. I do that because in Numbers 15, God says, when you look at the tzitzits, you will remember to live a holy life to God. Not when you look at the tzitzits, you'll remember that you're a Jew. That's not the case. So that's not why I do those things. So I think that, but I think that as far as how much a Gentile can assimilate, well, unfortunately, I think that depends on what your congregation is, because I think there's some congregations that are that place limitations, and I think that that's sinful behavior, very sinful behavior. To tell a Gentile that, or even women, even in some cases, because I believe that Jews and Gentiles can read from the Torah. I believe that men or women could carry the Torah. It's just I believe that those are things that I think that should be allowed. I think that a Gentile. I think that Gentiles can hold leadership positions. I think they can teach Hebrew. They can learn and teach it. They can learn and teach the Word of God. All those things. I think that the message of the Bible is God loves you. He wants you to love Him, and He will take you as far as you want Him to take you. That's the message of the Bible, is that God loves people. And I think that as far as but that's how I feel about as far as how, because David had posed that question earlier, like how much do you think a Gentile should be able to assimilate? As much as they want. And to place limitations on them, I think, is just dastardly. And some congregations are really good about being really nice about it. Really nice about it. And I think it's just putting a smile over something really ugly.
Right.
And you may be sincere in why you think it's a good thing to put limitations on Gentiles or make discriminations against, but it's ugly. As far as, but the problem is, and I don't know, sometimes I just don't think these issues are going to be solved until Messiah returns. Because the fact of the matter is that if you talk to somebody in the church, they think that Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur and Sukkot and Passover are Jewish things. And Jewish people also are culprits because they say that's Jewish stuff. When God specifically said, this is my stuff. So, Jew or Gentile, if you belong to God, that's also your stuff. And so I think that you have a double issue there. And, this podcast isn't going to solve that problem. Me saying this isn't going to solve that problem. But you have Gentiles that are just, and so much of American culture especially is built around people going to church. Soccer games are on Saturday. I mean, I even have seen people in Messianic synagogues, I've seen Messianic leaders harp on parents taking their kids to sports games, but I've seen that very Messianic leader's wife miss Shabbat services because they're taking their kid to a baseball game. So, shut up. But the fact of the matter is that, my kid just isn't going to play sports or he'll miss games. He'll miss games. That's what he'll do. Because I'm not going to sit there and tell people that the Shabbat should be important and then let Brooke or my son miss Shabbat service so he can go kick a ball around. That's stupid. Or throw a ball around. Who cares? Yeah. But the fact of the matter is that so much of American culture is built around church. And again, and when I have that conversation with people who are in the church, they have no defense for Sunday because there's not a good defense. There's two obscure scriptures because the disciples did something on the first day. So, well, that's why we do it. Well, they did something on every day. Well, they did this on the first day. They met on the first day. Well, you meet on Wednesday. You know what I'm saying? So, but what they always go back to is, well, I just don't think it really matters. Of course it matters. It matters. It's not your salvation. You're not going to hell over it, but it matters. It matters. So, but again, I mean, I know I went a few different directions there, but I mean, ultimately, I think that you have a problem in the church, and I think you have a problem too with a non-Jew trying to get into Messianic Judaism. I think that if you're in a congregation that has no barriers for Gentiles, I think you're going to be in for a really wonderful time. You're not going to be berated because, hey, you Gentiles just don't understand what it's like to be a Jew. Well, help me. That's why I'm here. You know what I'm saying? And I hear these rabbis give the same messages over and over and over, year after year after year, about how you Gentiles just don't understand salvations of the Jews. Of course they understand salvations of the Jews. Of course that's why they're out of the Messianic synagogue. If they didn't care if salvation was of the Jews, they go to some stupid church with replacement theology. So, I think you have two issues. I think that how much you can assimilate as a Gentile in a Messianic congregation depends on whether or not the Jewish leadership in your congregation is gatekeeping the stuff, which is bad to gatekeep that stuff. And if you're in the... but also you have a larger issue with America being so culturally rooted in Christianity, not actually rooted in Christianity. If the church was more rooted in Christianity, if America was more rooted in Christianity, it'd be a better place. We're not very rooted in Christianity, but culturally we are. Culturally, it's much easier to go to church. So... all that to say.
Yeah.
I know I threw a lot out there. I'm just saying.
Oh, no, it's fine. I was just pondering. Yeah, I think part of the question.
I think Jonathan said, "I forgot I was supposed to be thinking too,
No.
and I was just listening, and now I got to catch up."
I've been thinking about, I think part of the question is, when is assimilation a bad thing? Because we talk about assimilation, especially on Hanukkah season. We talk about assimilation, don't assimilate. And to a degree, that's, it depends on where you are. Because where is assimilation a bad thing? Well, if you're supposed to be one way, but you assimilate in the other direction, then it becomes a bad thing. Mm-hmm. I think particularly when it comes to the Jewish people, when you become a believer in Yeshua, you're called to live a certain life. God calls you to be a light to the world, and that involves doing certain things. And so if you move away from doing those things, from being that person who God has called you to be, then, you are, then that would be a bad form of assimilating. But, if you're, let's say, you grew up in a secular Jewish household, you become a believer and start attending a Messianic synagogue, right, and you pick up a Jewish lifestyle, again, you assimilate back into what you were supposed to be in all along, living the life that you were supposed to be living. When it comes to non-Jews assimilating, one of my favorite passages from ancient literature comes from what would arguably be the earliest written Messianic document, the Didache. And some would call it a Christian document, but it's early enough where it's actually written to Gentiles, so it's very specific that this is a Messianic Jewish thing. It's distinct that this is a Jewish movement still. So I just call it a Messianic document, and there are others who do the same. And because I belong to the school of thought that believes it was very early written, and one of the passages in it talks about when it comes to bearing the things of the Lord, do all that you can. And the passage, I'm pretty sure if my memory serves me right, comes directly after talking about certain things regarding food. So, you're not going to learn everything in one day. So when non-Jews come into a Messianic synagogue, and it's very clear that God brought you there to be there, to live there, to adopt a Messianic lifestyle, that you do it, but that you also do it with patience and with understanding.
Yeah, sure.
That you are things are changing, and sometimes that can be painful. It can be difficult to change. It can be difficult to come from a family that went out to the barbecue pit every Sunday evening as a family and got the pulled pork sandwiches all together, the family meal plan or whatever. It can be difficult to walk away from things like Christmas or Halloween, even. Because there's some Christians who celebrate Halloween. So, understand as a non-Jew assimilating that it's going to take time. And you're not going to get it all right at once, because I've seen so many people, many non-Jews who do that. They just absolutely beat themselves up, like as they're folding into the community. And again, it's not about becoming this perfect practitioner of Jewish life and tradition. It's about folding into the lifestyle that God lays before you, particularly as it relates to the community you're in, particularly as it relates to the rabbi that you're under. You're not expected to do more than what you've been given. If you've only been given through grade 3 math, you're not expected to do more than grade 3 math. And so you come in and you're like, okay, this community observes this level of kashrut, so this is the level I'm going to adopt. And depending on where you are, maybe that's not going to be the easiest thing for you to do. If you live in a community, particularly in Israel, where your community observes and teaches, having 2 kitchens, that as a non-Jew, that may take time to get to that. If that's your goal to get to that, you just getting rid of pork and shellfish can be, for some people, a challenge. And again, it's more of a challenge for people here where we live because A, we live in the South, B, we also live on the coast. So Southern cooking includes a lot of pork, and here on the coast, a lot of shrimp, lobster, crab. So if those things are deeply rooted in your lifestyle, and the things you're used to buying, the dinners you're used to serving, that can be difficult. That can take time. So Shabbat, like you're saying, sports. If you have kids and they're already in extracurriculars and sports and theater, that can be really difficult to all of a sudden wrench life in a completely different direction. And so, when it comes to assimilating as non-Jews into Messianic Jewish communities, that's where I would say, take your time, prayerfully, obviously with intention. Don't we'll get there one day and then never do anything to actually step out.
Right.
But if let's say, because we've had families who do this, we've had families who people may have a job on Shabbat. Their work actually may include Shabbat as a work day. And so there's several months where we might see them once a month on Shabbat, or during studies during the week. But then half a year later, they end up with a job change, or they get a position change, and it's something they've been praying about and working towards getting, so that way they can have Shabbat off for work. I had a good friend one time. He's still a good friend. It's not like one time I had a friend. But I have a good friend who he had been working in a job for about a decade, long time, and had never had Saturdays off. Started keeping Shabbat, started observing Shabbat, and he would have in a month, it would vary between 1 Saturday off a month to 2. So, and he decided he just put it one day, probably about 4 or 5 months into where it had just become increasingly encroaching upon his ability to get Saturdays off. He just said, you know what, I'm going to write up a formal letter to send to my company so that way they'll give me Shabbat off. But that didn't happen overnight. It didn't all of a sudden his life changed and he was like, oh, yep, Saturday now, no more Sunday. It took time. Mm-hmm. It took perseverance, which again can be painful. It can be arduous. It can lead to some uncomfortable conversations with family and coworkers and employers. But it was intentional, and there was still movement and direction. And that's what things like the Didache, some of the earliest teachings to non-Gentile believers outside of Acts, which even correlates with what we have in Acts, which is that we expect you to be doing this. Mm-hmm. There's a couple of things we expect you to be doing outright, things that are pretty easy, like sexual morality. You can drop that. That's pretty easy, because it's just don't go sleep with those people. Mm-hmm. Not eating blood. That's a conscious choice you can make today at lunch to stop doing. If you're participating, you can stop going into pagan temples and stop worshiping today. You do not have to make that decision any longer. But when you get into things like, and Paul writes about meat or vegetables, which days do you fast on? Which days do you not fast on? Those sorts of things. Those are progressive and those take time. And I would say so to non-Jews, the things you can change today, change. Mm-hmm. The things that need to be changed, anticipate and move towards making those changes. But understand you are not going to get it perfect all in one go. And nor should you pressure people to make all those changes in one go, because you'll break a person if we do.
Yeah, and that goes for Jewish people too, but you guys were speaking from a non-Jewish perspective, and I appreciate the insight you both shared. I was thinking as you were talking that historically the body of Messiah hasn't really been against assimilation. It's only been against assimilation in the new thing. So let me explain what I mean by that. When the congregations used to meet before the harpsichord was invented, they had services without music. And then the harpsichord was invented, and the harpsichord became an evil, demonic, modern contrivance that was ruining the worship, the purity of worship of just singing.
Right.
And then when the organ came to replace the harpsichord was the righteous and holy instrument, and the organ was the unrighteous modern contrivance ruining the beauty and glory of the organ. And then came the piano, and then came the radio, and the radio was this horrible, horrible thing that came along that we should stay away from, and it's all worldly and ungodly, until the television came. And when the television came, the radio became the airwaves of the believer, and there were radio preachers everywhere, but television was evil. And then came movies, or maybe movies and then television, movies and then television, and then the internet. And when the internet came out, the internet was evil, but people would use television. And so as things are created or invented, assimilation, the body of believers tends to be one step behind whatever's being invented and used, and so they stay away from those things, which unfortunately then seeded the radio to ungodliness until the movies came, or movies and then radio. And so we had movies and we had radio, and so movies were ungodly and then radio, so then we had some godly movies, and then when television came, we had some godly radio, but we're always one step behind in using, where the internet could have been, and in some cases is, one of the most powerful tools for sharing the good news. Yeah. We were years behind pornography in the use of the internet, because the internet was evil and to be stayed away from. So we did, the body of Messiah, when I say we, I mean the full body of Messiah, right, and seeded it for years to ungodliness before we started using it to, the truth is, in Messianic Judaism, very few congregations were live streaming their services until COVID hit. But how many ungodly things, how much pornography, how much of that was on the internet before the first real Messianic congregational service?
Well, and I'll tell you, after having visited some Messianic websites, like, we are in 2023, people. If your website still looks like
it's on Angel Fire,
you need to hire a 30-year-old who knows how to code and do web development.
And they make it real easy now.
Yeah, it's super easy now.
It's like a matter of dragging boxes over.
It's not even. It's like stupid easy.
Like Wix or something.
So this conversation about assimilation, much of it is that it's not that the body of believers doesn't assimilate. It's just that we assimilate one generation behind the rest of the world.
When we could have been on top
when
of
we
things.
Could have been the lead and in the head. We should have, when the internet was invented and started being available, we should have been the very first people on the internet using it as a tool to share the good news internationally in ways that we'd never thought of before. But we didn't. So we're generally one generation behind as far as an invention or a creation or a tool in using. And so we assimilate later into these things than we should have.
And one of the things that we mentioned before we started recording this conversation is that we talked about Jews assimilating into the church, because I know there are a lot of Jews in the church.
Yeah.
I don't think it's a bad thing. They have the most important thing. They have the substance, which is Messiah. That's the substance. I always say that over and over as a disclaimer, because I don't want people to think that I think that someone going to church because they go to church on Sunday and do Christmas and Easter that they're going to hell if they're not doing Shabbat and all those things. I don't think that. You know what I'm saying? I'm critical of things in the church. I'm critical of things in Messianic Judaism.
Yeah, it's whole reason we're here.
Like, for instance, but what I'm saying though is that I actually met a Jewish kid when I was interning at a Christian school. It was a church, and I was Messianic, but the students that at the school that I was interning at, they knew that I was attending a synagogue, and they introduced me to them. They said, "Oh, hey, this is blank," and I said, "Hey," and he goes, "Yeah, I'm Jewish." And I said, "Oh, really?" And he goes, "Yeah." He goes, "I didn't know there was a synagogue that, he didn't know there was a synagogue that believed in Jesus or anything like that." But he went to a church. His family went to a church. They were Jewish. Had a very Jewish last name and all that stuff, but his family just liked church. They just liked it. And that's fine. And you're just as saved and loved by God as me, and he's just as rich towards you as he is towards me. Right. I'm just saying, I will tell you this. I would rather be. I tell you where the church is doing it better than the Messianic synagogue, than the Messianic movement. I tell you where the church is doing better is if I was a Jew and I went to church on Sunday, if I wanted to be a deacon, I could be a deacon. There wouldn't be, well, are you Gentile? There wouldn't be any of that. If I wanted to teach Sunday school, well, wait a minute. You're Jewish. You're not a Gentile. Yeah, see, you have to understand we have to make the Gentiles feel very comfortable here. And the Gentiles have a unique identity that we want to preserve here at this church. Man, that crap doesn't happen at the church.
No.
That happens at some Messianic synagogues, though. It's killing these synagogues. And what it's killing an area of their ministry. Yeah. I'm not saying it's killing these synagogues, but it is you're getting some blockage in the flow of the Spirit. Let's say that. Right. Because my struggle as a Gentile in the movement over the years, man, if you're Jewish and you decide you want to go to a church, you're just a person walking in the doors, and that's what the church is doing right.
Yeah.
Everybody's made in the image of God. Everybody's a soul that needs to be saved.
Yeah.
But, I've actually heard a Messianic rabbi say, we need more Jewish people in this place. Okay, you can desire more Jewish people, but you don't need. And I think it's wrong to even say, no, I don't think it's okay to say you want more Jewish souls because that's part of our mission. That's a core part of our mission. But to say, yeah, we need more Jewish people in here. Why? Why? I mean, I understand why you would desire that,
right,
because it's part of our mission, but you have a bunch of Gentiles that'll take on hell with a water pistol with you. What's you know what I'm saying? Okay. So,
I want that T-shirt. I totally want that T-shirt. Yeah. I'll take on hell with a water pistol for you. That T-shirt. That should be our.
But no, it's like they would rather have this. Oh my gosh! Let somebody from Israel. They could be. It doesn't matter what they could be an Israeli that doesn't care about God, doesn't care about Yeshua, doesn't care about anything else. They walk into a place. Let's put him on stage and get him to talk. He's from Israel. You see. Come on, man. Chill out. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. I can tell you that happened to me in church, not in synagogue, is when I became a believer way back, 42 years ago. I didn't know anything about Yeshua except for the little bit of knowledge I had that made me believe in him, the prophecies and stuff. And instantly I was this Jewish believer that had the wisdom of the ages. And I was young enough and just weak enough in my faith that when people asked me questions, I would just make stuff up because I wouldn't say I don't know, because that was like, admitting you were ignorant, and I wasn't going to do that. So people would ask me some kind of question, and as if I had a matrix download of...
If only things have changed.
Yeah. as if I had a matrix download of the entire Bible because I was born Jewish.
Oh, yeah.
And I had the answers to every deep and mysterious question in the Bible. And so it is something that even happens in the church world, but it is something that within the Messianic Jewish world where there seems to be a priority.
Yeah, but I think sorry, I don't mean to cut you off here, but I see what you're saying and I agree with you, but it's not quite the same as what Toby was getting at. Like, Toby's, what he was saying was, a Jewish person can walk into a church and they're just another person. And it's not you're singled out because you're not Gentile. You becoming a believer as a Jewish person going into a church and there being there's this elevated status because you may know stuff.
Yeah, like I've never been in a synagogue where a non-Messianic synagogue where when I walked in the door, the first question they asked me was I Jewish?
Yeah.
Never once. And I've been in synagogues all over the country and other nations.
And not only that, but when you walk into a non-Messianic synagogue, you walk into a Reform or Conservative synagogue, doesn't matter if you're Jewish or not. They're not asking you that on the way in the door. You know what the first thing they'll do is, if you don't have one on, they'll hand you a kippah.
Right.
But in Messianic Judaism, there are Messianic synagogues that when a Gentile walks in, don't put a kippah on, that's ours. Don't put a talit on, that's ours.
Right, and the first question is, are you Jewish?
I helped another congregation with their membership stuff in the last couple of years, and when they asked me, would you send me your stuff, I sent them all of our documentation and everything, and the first question I got back was, we really like everything you have here, but we noticed you don't have anywhere on your membership application that asks if anybody's Jewish. Can we ask why? And I said, you're absolutely welcome to ask why, and here's the answer. And I unloaded, and they went, Oh, I never thought about that before. Because it's, we don't ask people if they're Jewish. Number one, because in a Messianic synagogue, it's kind of like, people joke about CrossFitters or vegans. Like, they're going to tell you they're a CrossFitter or a vegan, whether you ask or not. Right? In a Messianic synagogue, you're going to know who's Jewish. They're going to tell you. Like, they're going to tell you in a hurry.
I have never had, like, in my time here, every time we've had a Jewish couple visit who was definitely from like New York or Jersey and looked it and talked it and spoke it, never failed to mention they were Jewish.
but you're not going to have, you're generally not going to have that all the way around, right? So if a Jewish person walks in, they're going to let you know. So I don't need to ask somebody if they're Jewish or not on my visitor packet, on my membership packet or any of that. I don't have to, because that's going to come up in conversation. Not only that, but we're intentional at CMC, and I think you guys are too at Bredon. We're intentional on relationships. And so we intentionally develop relationships with people in our congregation, and through conversation, through getting to know one another, you really understand and determine who people are, versus the problem for me with putting it on a visitor packet or a membership packet or whatever is it's an instantaneous barrier that you're putting up, because somebody said, "Oh, I'm not Jewish. What are they going to think of me if I circle that I'm not Jewish? What are they going to and it's just a barrier that doesn't need to be there. And the way that we operate as a community, there's no like Rabbi Toby said earlier, we don't gatekeep stuff, right? Like, there's no barrier. It's full inclusivity and participation. And so I don't want to put up something that can be perceived as a barrier that would prohibit people from wanting to participate in the community. Right. And I don't need to ask if somebody's Jewish or not, because they're going to tell me. And it's pretty well straightforward.
Yeah, now, I will say, and probably it's getting close to time to wrap up this episode, and we'll probably talk about this topic again at length, but I want to say that while we don't gatekeep at our congregation whether a Jew or a non-Jew can read from the Torah, can carry the Torah, can wear tzitzit, can do those things, we do gatekeep, at least at our congregation, and how they do those things. Sure. In other words, at our congregation in particular, if a woman wants to wear a prayer shawl or a talit, it's going to be a female talit.
Yeah,
because
I agree with that.
Because there is scripture that says for men and women not to wear, or women not to wear men's apparel.
It just looks weird when I see it.
Right. So there are things we gatekeep in the proper way to do
Correct.
a tradition, or but not will can they do it? But if they do it the right way.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because every time somebody mentions women wearing talits, my mind always goes to when I was in the airport one time, and I think I was going to visit Brooke. I think it was before we were getting married, and I was just going to get my boarding pass, and these women were walking, and I don't know if they were Jewish or not, but they were wearing talits like men talits, and it was the weirdest looking thing. It just looks weird.
Yeah, there are segments of
and that might offend somebody.
Reconstructionist,
right? And
Judaism
again, and that's a part of that
reform.
assimilating into to misusing things that aren't wrong to use, but misusing them. Running around a synagogue with a talit as if it was a Superman cape.
Yeah,
those kind of things are assimilating into a liberal, non-biblical usage of something, where just assimilating to using it. In other words, if a non-Jewish person, male or female, wants to wear a talit at our congregation, we welcome them to do that, because it's part of them wanting to be a part of us. But if they're going to do it, we're going to teach them on how to wear a talit, the different ways you can wear it, and the ways to respect it, not drag it on the ground, or all the kind of things that are relevant to doing it the proper way.
I mean, you can't really. It's like you don't want to say something to offend somebody, but I mean, you can't really talk about the very word of God without being offensive in some way. It should be, the word of God should offend things in ourselves.
Right. Should offend sin in our lives for sure.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So,
it should also offend the assimilation to bad ideas.
Right. So when I say, I don't understand how some people believe that they're above being wrong about something in their life. I'm wrong every day about something, but I just want to, But I also have a memory of the first time I ever witnessed a bat mitzvah. It was actually at Brooks Congregation, old congregation, which was Baruch Hashem in Dallas, and the young lady was wearing this really beautiful, ornate female talit. It was clearly made, and it was so elegant and nice. I'm a guy because that's how God made me.
Right.
I'm not better than a female. We're both made in the image of God. I don't think men's talits are better than women's talits. That's the thing. If a young lady or a woman was like, well, I want to wear a men's talit, I'd say, well, why? Well, I just like them better. I'm like, well, there's the same thing. And I'm sorry, but I agree with Rabbi Eric on that in the sense that, like, I would say, listen, this is, the fact is that it's not. I don't wear men's. I don't think that women shouldn't wear men's talits because I think men are better or because they're more privileged to wear this certain type of talit. It's the same as women's clothes versus men's clothes. You know what I'm saying?
Right. That's a distinguishing factor.
Women are awesome. I'm married to one. I mean, women are incredible.
Yeah.
But so are men. It's in our own lanes.
Yeah. I think if I can say one more thing, that there was when I talk about not assimilating into bad ideas, because again, assimilation is the conforming to an ideal or a pattern of beliefs and behaviors. And, there are certain practices in the business world, particularly America and corporate America, that have been used notoriously by religious leaders to kind of push their own agendas. In the past and still today, we can see the effects of these things. There's this idea, and I think this goes to part of our conversation that we've had many times about leaders training and raising younger leaders. There's this one of those what are they called, tabloids? Like, I call it, it's not that it's fake medicine, but I call it tabloid medicine. It's those links and articles you can read online that make you feel better about yourself or wherever you are in life. And there is science and things and discussions on mental health and physical health about things like your 70s are a new era. You are a new person. You are, you can be even greater in your 70s than you were in the previous decades of your life. It's still, as long as you're still alive, it's still a new time to find a new thing, to do more, to be better, which is true. I agree with that. But I have heard that used before, and it participates in an idea that largely it assimilates to the American secular idea of life is about me. It's about what I can get. It's about what I can do. It's about how I can be, about how successful I can make my thing. And it assimilates right alongside that. Mm-hmm. And I've seen that used to posture up, to posit the idea that just because you're an older leader doesn't mean that you have to look to be replaced. Right. Because horizons, the horizon is the goal. It's a bigger and better future for me at 72, 73. I got forever. I don't need to worry about the future. I don't have to think about what's going to happen after me because it's about my time and my being better. So,
yeah. Well, that was one of the sessions at the IMCS Rabbis Conference. Was it last year? 2 years ago. 2 years ago.
Yeah, 2 years ago.
Had the highest highest attendance of under 40. Leaders at the Rabbis Conference, and the entire conference was tailored to the 60-plus crowd. In particular, one session getting up and saying, if you're in your 60s, 70s, and 80s, don't give up because your best days are ahead of you, and you're going to be in there till the day you die. And I'm like, you know what?
We're
not foresighting.
I'm not opposed to telling people, no matter what age they are, that the best is yet to come, because I'm absolutely all for the best is yet to come, especially for people who are our seniors, our elders, our leaders, our teachers. But the idea that stems from that is an idea that then doesn't take hold of the responsibility that you have to actually raise up younger leaders. Mm-hmm. And we see that principle and that attitude come from that. So don't assimilate into that.
We'll save the remainder of that conversation for another episode, because that's a whole that's a whole other thing. But with that said, we appreciate you joining with us as we wrestle with these concepts and using Hanukkah as a launching board to the discussion of assimilation and whether or not, and good or bad and what have you. And please feel free to share with us your thoughts and comment on this conversation. And we will see you guys next week.
Thank you for listening to the MessianTics Podcast. Make sure to subscribe so you can be notified every time we drop a new episode. And be sure to follow and interact with us on social media at MessianTics Podcast.